Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about a movie called Maximum Overdrive. Ultimately, this movie is on Amazon right now. Ultimately, if you have an Amazon Prime account, with any amount of time, you could ultimately see this movie for absolutely free. If you ultimately have a Amazon Prime account regardless, you can go ahead and watch this movie. Evidently, this film is a Stephen King film. Ultimately, if you want to go out of your way to say that you saw this film within a very severely free notion, you could download any number of apps, probably like a Movie Pro app, or ultimately you can in fact download like a movie box or movie play box or some other kind of app at the end of the day that you could go out of your way to download and probably watch a movie with ads, but there in fact it would be absolutely free. So ideally within this movie, I kind of remember this movie along with several others where it would just tend to be like a movie where a car would drive itself or a truck would drive itself, or in a notion you would just have this like you would have this machine of sorts that would take upon themselves to do their own thing at some sort of time. Reasonably, we have, of course, Maximum Overdrive, but we also have a movie called Trucks. We also have a Charlie Sheen movie called The Wraith, which is mostly done with a guy who drives around in a vehicle to try to kill people. We have The Car. The movie there was this movie on Netflix at one point called The Car, and ultimately that was just a car that was like seeking revenge. I think it's like The Car of Revenge or something like that. I ultimately saw a very stupid movie called I think Killer Bed, The Bed That Eats. I've seen all kinds of weird things at the end of the day, and really, when looking at this, you can't help but also think that Christine was probably like an earlier attempt of this, or kind of somewhere in the lines of attempting a car that could probably drive itself at some notion. So, going into this movie, I really actually thoroughly enjoy it. With the exclusion of there's some vicious scenes going on here that there's some bits and pieces from just like, man, could they have not shot that one scene? It looks a little too dark or too but everything else kind of really, I thought it was like overall like it's a really fun movie, but when also looking at it, it's kind of like people just kind of biding their time a lot, and so also are the semis in this film. Because there's only so much you can do. There's only so many times you can try to, especially like during this time period, like just like everything is just okay. Well, we're just gonna run this person over, and this and that. There's probably not much to really do in, to be brutally honest, like a film like this, and I think that's why they would never probably go back and like, yeah, let's try this one again. You could do it in a much more CGI'd like environment, but it's just the fact that like there isn't much to really do differently, like heavily differently. But it would be kind of interesting to see like little things that could kill people come in a remake like way. To ultimately, there seemed to be some kind of like battery devices that would ultimately attack people, or like it would just be some kind of small little things that ultimately could go out of the way to take someone out. And I thought that that was kind of interesting. Anyways, so reasonably, this story is quasi interesting, but then also it's quasi strange. And ultimately, when watching this film back, I'm like, oh, so they just had some like random reason that didn't quite make sense of how all of a sudden these electrical devices just came to life one day. But it seems that not every single like item all came all to life at some point in time, because really we have a married couple that's in this movie that I'm like, okay, why is it that all of a sudden their car didn't all of a sudden just like take off on its own? um But if anything, I really enjoy how this movie kind of like reminds me of those like old fashioned like monster movies like a Tremors or something like that, where like there was a build up to things. It wasn't just like, oh, here's the monster and ultimately he's just going to easily and quickly kill somebody and then just move on to the next person to quickly kill somebody. And just like it's like it has that build. It doesn't have the like, well, somebody like one monster is just gonna tear through six people in an hour and a half, and ultimately it's gonna take 30 minutes or 45 minutes for the one person to get away, and it's gonna take another 45 to 30 minutes of a monster just running through like 20 other people, and but then getting to the six close friends that this main character has, um, which this monster runs through them in like 10 minutes. But anyways, so going on to this film, I think that there were some interesting things going on in this movie. I do like it to where it seems that uh, they had created this story to where it seemed that you have an entire time an entity that does not talk. It kind of reminds you of Jaws in some ways, or it kind of reminds you of like what is to happen if technology just takes over, which I'd ultimately have to fear at some point that eventually that is going to happen when people make too many like, hey, let's make a smart home and let's make a smart this and let's make a smart that. Yeah, eventually somebody's going to hack into your smart stuff and you're never going to see the light of day again, sadly enough. Um, but yeah, so reasonably, I really enjoy the fact that really this movie could be remade and ultimately done completely differently. Just for the fact that you could have like tie in all the like GPS items or whatever that like drones and stuff like that we would have to have now. You could probably do an entire film without there actually being a semi and or truck involved. But reasonably it could just be like to where ultimately eventually when people shell their way outside to otherwise run from the things that are inside a place, it pushes them right back in because ultimately we have semis and whatever eventually. Anyways, it's a moot point. Technology has really advanced. Huzzah for that, I guess. But anyways, so going on into this movie, I really do enjoy this film, even though it's fairly slow. Uh, Whenever you do get to watch an Emilio Estevez film, it really feels like you really put a lot of work in to find that movie. Because Emilio Estevez hadn't really done much of anything, with the exclusion of maybe like the Mighty Ducks or Breakfast Club, or ultimately uh, probably what would it be? When you did the movie The Billy the Kid, I don't know what movie that's called. Probably like Outlaws or something, or Young Guns or something like that. Um, but yeah, other than that, we haven't had Emilio Estevez do very much. So whenever with the big key movies that I've mentioned, like any other movies that you would find Emilio Estevez doing, you had to put in some work to find those. Uh, but we have some very interesting actors in here. A lot of people that didn't really get a lot of movies off in their belt, so to speak. One that kind of really reached out to me or made me like just go, "Oh wow, that's nice." We had Smith. Yeardley Smith, I believe is how to pronounce that name. Uh, Playing Connie in this movie. I'm like, oh hey, that's the girl that does the voice for Lisa on The Simpsons. I'm like, I know her from being that. I know she had kind of done some movies here and there and this and that, but ultimately when looking at it, I'm like, oh yeah, that's the girl that does the voice for Lisa on The Simpsons. Um, We also have the person that plays Hendershot, who ultimately is Pat uh, Hingle, Hingle, that ultimately played Commissioner Gordon in a lot of the Batman films. When it goes from like Keaton to like Batman and Robin, he's kind of like the go-to Commissioner Gordon for that franchise. The only person that, besides Alfred, has stayed through a litany of all those films. So going on into here, I enjoy this movie, but at the end of the day, you could also say that it's a very slow film. But I like how eventually we get into seemingly like into the wild of this approach of these machines going haywire. How basically some of the deaths are kind of cool looking, but then also others are kind of like chintzy looking. I'm like, okay, this kind of seems a little dumb, but it is what it is. So, anyways, and I'm ultimately looking for one person specifically. Yeah. Funny enough, we have Giancarlo Esposito. Ultimately, the guy that was currently in The Mandalorian was actually in this movie as a video game player. He was a guy that was in the arcade, and he ultimately gets what he gets into the arcade. I was like, oh wow! Like I was so amazed. I'm like, yeah, I know that guy from The Mandalorian. Um, but yeah. So, anyways, and we also have Christopher Murney, who ultimately I know him as being the villain from The Last Dragon. I'm like, oh my god, he's in this movie? Like, just a cluster of just really interesting actors being having either small roles or just being in this movie, and I thought that was fascinating. So let's go out of our way to talk about this movie. Yeah, it kind of gets off into some interesting territory. I don't like the fact that we have to kind of narrate what kind of happened at the very beginning of this film, where we have like a comet that supposedly lands onto the Earth, and then ultimately we have something to do with like UFOs and such at the very end of this movie. Okay, sure. I was like, what? Like, I am so confused. Like, ultimately, they're talking about comets and UFOs. And I'm like, what is going on in this movie? With all, like, print or whatever. Like, did they not have time to just quickly and easily give us some scene of sorts that showcases what happens for this movie? It's like they kind of took some time into just uh, like I think if they probably remade this, they would probably have to, instead of showcasing that some comet via print hit, like they would visually probably show that for the opening sequence of this movie. Excuse me. But anyways, moving on. So we ultimately have it to where it seems that we have some setup and kind of setting up of this green goblin headed like semi that otherwise arrives in in a gas station somewhere in the middle of nowhere. It seems like this town seemingly just has like a lot of stretch of being able to get to anywhere. Um, it ultimately seems that one of the gas station attendants ultimately tries to put gas or diesel in one of the trucks and ultimately gets a boatload of gas in his face for his troubles. Ultimately, to seemingly be blinded. And, like, I thought that was kind of very interesting and like, of how we were going to approach how this person ends up getting eventually what comes to him. But yeah, I don't know if I've talked to. Did I say spoilers? Did I say spoilers? Check out this on Amazon if you already have a Prime account, but go in any amount of apps at any time to check this out. So spoiler time. About the time I get spoil this movie. I don't know if I said that, so we're spoiling this movie now. So recently we queue up a married couple that is just driving their way to ultimately just kind of get through this town. Ultimately, to have seemingly a ton of semis all driving into one direction, and yeah, we eventually have it to where this wedded couple is ultimately making their way to seemingly some gas station, and they find some attendant dead, which ultimately leads them into seemingly have some tow truck that ultimately tries to run them down, ultimately leading them to scramble and just like, what the heck is going on? We have to where the married man, I believe, is Kurt, ultimately getting to the point where there's some beam that falls over him and he has to scramble his way to get away from this tow truck that ultimately is going to come after him. And so ultimately, we have it to where the married couple just drive off, not understanding what the heck happened. So, pushing on, we eventually have a seemingly montaging scene of stuff that is going on outside of this gas station slash restaurant. And here's what happens. So, we ultimately have some baseball team, some junior baseball team or whatever, some kid baseball team that ultimately had won their baseball game, and you have the coach that's like, "Hey guys, because you won this game, yeah, drinks are on me, woo!" And so we have the coach who ultimately goes to the vending machine, is like, "Yeah, I'm gonna get myself a Pepsi or whatever the drink is of this generation." So ultimately, the guy ultimately goes to the vending machine, and the vending machine smacks out a pop that hits this guy in the nuts, and he's go, "Oh!" And so the vending machine hits this guy in the nuts yet again. And I'm like, "Good God, vending machine! What a vicious vending machine!" But that's not all. We start having this vending machine crack this guy over the head, and then all these vending machine pops start flinging out and hitting all these kids to where there's two that get knocked over, but we have one kid who ultimately is the catcher of this team that ultimately is like desperately trying to get to his coach, but he's realizing, dude, my coach is dead. So ultimately he makes his way off to find his father that ultimately is that same gas station attendant that ultimately has been blinded by gasoline. So we also have this kid who, while again making his way to his father, he goes throughout the town to ultimately see that there had been several people been killed by certain appliances. It seems that we find a girl that ultimately gets seemingly choked by, I guess, like a hair dryer of sorts. We see a police, a mini police vehicle ultimately seemingly lodged in the mouth of a dog, and that is awful. We have several people that had either seemingly been run over or any kind of other things, to the point of having just these interesting visuals. It seems at some points we just kind of randomly see every once in a while like a person who had gotten killed by some means, either by getting choked by their car window or some other weird thing going on there. But anyways, yeah, there's some interesting visuals of sorts that end up going on into this, but there's also some gruesome visuals as well. So we have it to where Emilio Estevez, which is Bill, ultimately is talking to Hendershot, ultimately mentioning that it's like, so, like, I'm doing a 9-hour shift, but you only want me to punch in for 8 hours. Because Bill, unfortunately, has this backstory where he had done something wrong against the law. And so, basically, Pat's character, which is Hendershot, is kind of taking advantage of Bill as much as he possibly can. If ultimately this part when we get to this restaurant kind of heavily reminds me of the Dennis Quaid movie Legion, Which ultimately I'm like, yeah, like I have so many feelings of Legion when I watch this movie, because when looking at it, it's kind of like Legion in this movie are almost kind of like shot for shot. There's also an ice cream truck that seems to be appearing and going through this town that the ice cream has blood on it. The ice cream truck has blood on it. And so I thought that that was just kind of a fascinating visual of a ice cream truck driving itself. Where in the movie Legion, you have a eventually an ice cream truck that drives all its way to get to these people, and then you just have a stunt man that, of course, has done numerous other things like Silver Surfer, and he just becomes a very elongated man that ultimately tries to attack people and gets shot for his trouble. Uh, so we ultimately have seemingly a traveling salesman who ultimately is with a woman that ultimately he is consistently grabbing the leg of, and ultimately just calling her like sweet cakes and like all this other stuff. Like really, just like, yeah, I'm gonna take advantage of this woman while bizarrely, ironically, selling Bibles to people. Okay, interesting. So that ultimately is played by, of course, Christopher Murney, which ultimately he plays Camp Loman. Loman? And ultimately we have a girl who is named Brett, who eventually can quickly seem like she's just kind of a hitchhiker. She's just kind of like thumbing it through her ways to ultimately just keep going to a certain location, ultimately bumping into Bill, who is Emilio Estevez's character, and is like, you know what? Like, this is the best looking man at this location, so I guess I just need to just, like, plant my lips on this man. And ultimately just try to cement that me and him have to have a relationship, because more than likely we're probably going to die soon, anyways, because craziness is happening. And who knows how many times that Brett has probably shacked up with any number of people in this world before she got to Emilio Estevez. So we ultimately have it to where this salesman is ultimately just consistently, repetitiously grabbing the leg of this woman. To ultimately, she is almost going to threaten him, if you grab my leg one more time. Because ultimately, he's like, because ultimately she is ultimately threatening him that it's like, this however long we travel is all depending on however long that you're going to keep continually grabbing my leg. And so we ultimately have it to where we meet these people going into this establishment, and we are now starting to get slowly but surely people to die from these electrical devices. At first, we have seemingly uh, one of the waitresses who ultimately gets a electric knife in her arm, and ultimately this electric knife starts to try to get closer and closer to this waitress, and ultimately trying to stab her, to where Emilio Estevez has to take a hammer and kill it. Where ultimately everybody's like, "Yeah, you get that knife." Just turn it off, or otherwise just like do something. Anyways, so we have it to where that happens at first, and so reasonably, uh, we're having it to where like Emilio Estevez is yelling at people like, uh, like, get her a band-aid, get her a cloth, get her something, and ultimately she just like has to like someone gives him a bandana and she puts a bandana over it. Okay, sure. So ultimately we push on. So ultimately we have it to where it seems like at first the Green Goblin semi that ultimately is uh, the the toy semi, the the whichever, however you like, the one that sticks out the most. Um, Ultimately, this thing starts to wheel on its own, and ultimately, we have the semi driver of this truck who ultimately is just Handy. His name is Handy. Frankie Faison is named Handy. Okay, sure. Uh, what a weird name. Ultimately, he is driving that rig, and ultimately he's like, well, yeah, that's kind of strange that like somebody would have had to have like been the best hot wire person in town because ultimately I have the keys right here. So we ultimately have Emilio Estevez having to go and seemingly check on everything because he's just that kind of guy. And so ultimately, we have Emilio Estevez who checks out this other guy's truck to see if someone's in it, and no one is in there. Um, that's what kind of really starts this off, and so we eventually have it to where ultimately uh, we have it to where there seems to be one semi that eventually is going to wreck the car of the Bible salesman and ultimately just kind of like spin around and whatever. But to the point where ultimately we also see that at some point that the guy who had been blinded by gasoline is trying to go to get to his son, and ultimately everybody's convincing him that he can't see well enough, and ultimately like, dude, like it's crazy to go out here right now. There's like we're not really quite understanding what's all going on, and so reasonably we have it in this point of time that the gas station attendant gets run over, and ultimately we have it to where also the Bible salesman ends up getting knocked clear onto this seemingly pond. And so everybody at this point is really and truly starting to really freak out at this point, to where we have Hendershot who ultimately comes out with a bazooka to fire at this truck. And so I guess that's when people are, I guess, coming to terms that, oh my god, these things are all driving themselves. This makes no sense. So we ultimately have it to where seemingly more and more semi trucks are making their way to this gas station. And like you can just see this crazy visual of just more and more trucks just coming to get gas at this place. And so ultimately we have Bill and Brett who ultimately seemingly get together and ultimately do some quasi bedroom business, I guess, because reasonably it's just like, dude, we're gonna die. We're gonna die soon. We have the one waitress who is consistently, repetitiously screaming like, "We made them! We made you!" Because ultimately she's just losing her freaking mind. Um, and so recently everybody's kind of like also speculating like, why is it that all of a sudden this is all happening? It must be coming from that comment. Ultimately, the news has some kind of coverage of like, well, it must just be this comet that's taking over the planet, I guess. Um, so reasonably, we eventually have it to where people are quickly but surely eventually coming to a decision of like, hey man, like one, we gotta find out what Hendershot has in his arsenal, and man, does he have a boatload of crap. Because ultimately we have it to where Bill asks, I think Larry, I think it's Larry, might be Larry or Barry, uh, the guy that's in the crapper. He's ultimately asking him is like, hey, like, does Hendershot have like quite a bit of uh like weaponries or stuff? Because ultimately the guy ultimately mentions like a little bit of something that like, hey, we have plenty of, and Hendershot's like, shut up, like I got it from my Christmas stocking. But ultimately we find out that Hendershot has an arsenal of seemingly grenades and everything, and Hendershot's like, ultimately, when Emilio's character and Brett end up finding this stuff out, he's like, "Oh well, like you found me out," kind of thing, and it's like, yeah, so what? So you have an arsenal, like, dude, you're like the like share it around, like, dude, like, who cares if you have guns? Like, nobody's gonna try to like take advantage of you or whatever. Um, but ultimately, we find that Emilio Estevez had done something stupid in his youth, and ultimately leading him into be in prison, and ultimately leading him to be a diner or a cook in this restaurante. So pushing on, we ultimately have it to where seemingly uh, people are very slowly but surely eventually dying at some point, but we also have it to where they keep whenever there's a semi that seems to be going completely awry, they have a bazooka to nullify this, um, which they repetitiously at some point use. So we ultimately have it to where there seems to be a bulldozer and uh, a army vehicle that has a gun on top of it, that ultimately is going to be used to send a Morse code message to the people. And luckily, there's one lick of anybody, especially the young kid that eventually makes his way back to this restaurant, this diner, that ultimately this kid knows Morse code. Um, we ultimately have to have Emilio Estevez and Kurt eventually going down into the sewers to try to rescue the Bible salesman, but instead they find the kid instead because the Bible salesman is basically dead by the time they get there. So it seems like we start to realize that, hey, like going into the sewer is probably going to be the best beneficial thing to be able to get away from all these trucks, and so they use it quite consistently in this movie. So we have it to where ultimately, and that's what kind of makes them get their escape plan. Because their escape plan is, of course, like, hey, well, there's some boats that don't have motors in them, so ultimately, yeah, we can just find a boat that doesn't have a motor, and I think we'll be fine. And that's their kind of escape at the end of all this. So recently, I would have liked it to just like, how about it just like they end up either all dying, or reasonably they just kind of like, there is no way out of all this, and that would have been cool. But ultimately, the escape ending is always good for having people escape eventually. But anyways, so and kind of exploding that entire environment eventually looks also really cool as well. So Bill, ultimately Emilio, ultimately is coming up with a master plan of like, hey, like we can just have a boat and escape that way. And Brett's like, wow, you're a really smart individual. So we eventually get to the point where ultimately people are ending up dead. I believe Hendershot also ends up dead at some point via being shot with this military esh like gun. Because ultimately we have it to where seemingly Hendershot tries to take out the bulldozer with the bazooka again, and that just leads to where the military vehicle of sorts is going to shoot its way through this entire diner, uh, killing a bunch of restaurateurs in this place. We ultimately had the one guy who ultimately had touched a an arcade device earlier, and ultimately him touching that arcade device led to him to be electrocuted and or killed. Didn't quite make sense to me. It was kind of weird. Um, but anyways, we lead on to eventually this military device giving Morse code, and of course, again, the kid is the only one that knows Morse code. Ultimately, the machines ultimately want gas. All the semis and all everybody wants gas. So ultimately, we have every single pump being emptied, and we just have this montage of them giving gas to every single semi. And ultimately, more is soon to come. Ultimately, to the point where Emilio says, "Hey, we're empty." To ultimately, there is seemingly a gas tanker that is going to forcibly have Emilio's character fill things up, to where everybody eventually is just utterly exhausted. So we have it to where eventually that these guys are too exhausted to the point of almost delirium. You have Emilio talking that ultimately all these semis and everything like that are just there to eventually sweep them all away. So these semis are all broomsticks and or brooms, and they're gonna sweep them all away. And I was like, okay, this is utter delirium that this guy is talking. But we eventually have it to where Emilio is starting to feel better, and where otherwise he is talking to one of the people, and ultimately like, hey, we're planning our escape, and the one thing that we're gonna have to do is take out this military vehicle that has this gun that is attached to the vehicle, and so we have it to where Emilio is just talking to one of his gas attendants, and ultimately, like they're just kind of like, "Hey, how's your day going?" Ba 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 ba, and ultimately the gun is kind of just following them around, and ultimately Emilio is just like, "Well, hey, man, like we're just talking, and like, hey, we're just having a normal conversation," and ultimately you have Emilio talking to his other associate, and he's like, yeah, you need to run. Like, yeah, I'm going to tell you to run. You're going to do that and go ahead and run. So ultimately, what Emilio ends up doing is he throws a grenade into this military vehicle, and the military vehicle explodes. And so ultimately, they're deciding, like, okay, everybody get into the sewer, and we're going to make our escape. Because ultimately, the semi vehicles are all going to be angry that that they feel tricked and whatever. So ultimately, we have it to where reasonably the guys are going into the sewers and ultimately trying to make their escape at night, and all the semis are just basically crushing through this entire establishment, uh, just bulldozing through it, or otherwise crushing everything in sight. Crashing through it with an oxygen tank that explodes this entire environment, and so on and so forth. While we have Emilio and all of everybody making their way out to this boat, we see this amazing visual of this just entire environment that they were at, completely crushed and annihilated. Every single thing is completely destroyed. Every single gas pump and everything, all completely annihilated in fantastic degree, to where everything eventually just all explodes at the end. It's great. So we have it to where ultimately Emilio is making his way to this boat, and we have it to where there is one guy that is stubbornly is just like, well, hey, I wanna look at this big ring, this big rock, as if that's going to make any beneficial use to anybody in this current state, in this current time. And ultimately, we have it to where we have the Green Goblin semi truck that is ultimately going to make one last kill before he ends up getting blown up. Because we have the Green Goblin truck that ultimately runs over this guy who's getting this ring, and we have Emilio who ultimately takes a bazooka to this Green Goblin truck, and ultimately it just completely explodes, and everybody's like, "Yeah, let's get out of here!" And ultimately we have them just boat their way off to ultimately just in text terms, ultimately telling us that hey, like some UFO bizarrely showed up, and ultimately uh, it led to eventually everyone eventually surviving, but like they're like there was all craziness that tended to happen via this point. But yeah, an interesting movie. I thought it was fun. I think it's like a good, like it's a very slow burn kind of film. But when looking at it, like I just kind of find it to just be like, ah, this is kind of a fun movie to watch every once in a while. I like these kind of movies uh, when you have it to where the entire like I kind of like the movies where you don't have the villain that has to say a word sometimes. I think those movies are kind of fun, like a Jason Voorhees, where like of course like the person isn't going to say a lick of anything, but you are just going to wait to this gruesome kill at some point where Jason pops in some window somewhere, or he's ultimately going to grab somebody and choke them to death, or sling them against a tree or something like that. And that like those kind of films where eventually you have like Jaws and whichever, like those kinds of movies, like I always enjoy those because it just kind of reminds me of a simpler time where we had movies that could like um, easily just like it didn't have to be an overly complicated film, and it was just like an interesting concept. And I think that's what this movie really was, just a simple concept done by a Stephen adapted from a Stephen King book. And that's all I could say about this movie, so I'm gonna get out of here. Bye everybody. Bye everybody.